Hello and welcome to the IO Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. In 1980, the Esalen Institute established the Soviet-American exchange program. Recognizing that official government-to-government negotiations, track 1, were completely stalled, Esalen invited diplomats, academics, and psychologists to find a back channel. During an informal meeting at Esalen in 1981, a U.S. State Department official named Joseph Montville coined the phrase track 2 diplomacy. Before the internet, Esalen pioneered space bridges. In 1982, using cutting-edge satellite technology, they set up live interactive television links between ordinary citizens, rock musicians, and scientists in California and Moscow. Esalen also helped launch the Association of Space Explorers. They brought American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts together. Perhaps the most politically disruptive connection occurred in 1989, when Esalen's program sponsored and organized the first ever trip to the United States for Boris Yeltsin. During his tour, which included a visit to an American grocery shop, Yeltsin was shocked by Western prosperity compared to Soviet deprivation. Historians often know that this specific Esalen-sponsored trip deeply accelerated Yeltsin's abandonment of communism, which contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. We're going to speak about some details based on the Daniel Satinsky's book, Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy Through American Eyes. Hello, Daniel.
Hello.
Daniel Satinsky is an independent scholar, a retired attorney, and a retired business consultant. He began his career in Soviet Union, then Russia, as a part of a US-Russian telecom joint venture in 1991, and then he continued with business and consulting projects in Russia up to 2014. Over those years, he traveled extensively across the country from Moscow, St. Petersburg, the Central Russia Golden Ring cities, the Urals and Siberia. Subsequently, he has been researching and writing about the interaction between Americans and Russians in this unique historical period. After publishing his most recent book, Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy Through American Eyes, he has developed an oral history of interviews with foreigners active in Russia during the late 1980s through the early 2000s, available online as the Satinsky Archive. And now this includes 55 in-depth interviews. He was also a chairman of a board of the US-Russia Chamber of Commerce of New England from 2000 to 2014, and currently he is a local affiliate of the Davis Center at Harvard. So let's start with the first question. I want to ask, why did the Esalen Institute initiate that citizen diplomacy between the United States and Soviet Union, and how is it possible that United States had so many programs, special projects, but Esalen was able to get trust from the Soviets? And Boris Yeltsin basically came to the United States, which wasn't an ordinary event.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you asked a lot. In your introduction, you raised some of the aspects of citizen diplomacy that took place in that period connected with Esalen. But I want to change the focus a little bit because first of all, you have to be clear that Esalen was independent. It wasn't connected to the U.S. government. It was an independent institute that came out of a whole different time in American history, and it was originally focused on human potential and on sort of non-traditional ways of understanding human capabilities and the human potential movement. So the founders of Esalen, which were became aware that the Soviets were conducting research into the same things. So there was research about things like auras. I don't know if you even know what that means, but it's sort of the magnetic fields around individuals that can be captured in different colors, or communicating through with nonverbal means and all kinds of non-traditional understandings of the what later kind of became capsulized as the New Age philosophy, New Age psychotherapy, and humanistic psychology, a whole lot of words that was around this sort of amorphous set of people. And within that, Esalen was a center, but around Esalen were people who weren't formally part of it, who became part of the citizen diplomacy movement. So, along with the New Age philosophies that were developing. You have the tail end of the peace movement that came out of the opposition to the Vietnam War, and a whole set of sort of independent organizations who became concerned about the possibility of war between the Soviet Union and the US and wanted to stop it. So it was an evolution of the peace movement. So all of these things were percolating around, particularly in California, particularly in San Francisco and north of San Francisco. And Esalen, to go back to the question, Esalen became aware of the research that was being done through the Russian Academy of Sciences into human potential, and a conference that was held in 1979 in Tbilisi, Georgia, on these themes. And they sent two young researchers, Jim Hickman and his girlfriend at that time, her name is Mary. They went to this conference and they discovered what the Soviet researchers were doing. They formed sort of personal connections with particularly a guy named Joseph Golden, who was the secretary of a committee of the Russian Academy of Sciences that was studying human potential. Hickman came back and convinced the Murphys, Michael and Dulcie Murphy, who ran the Esalen Institute, that they should start a committee of Russian American studies. And so but it initially was based around these, common study of human potential. I mean, they were conducting experiments about whether someone could communicate in dreams between Moscow and San Francisco. This was not a political enterprise when it began. It was, and then around it was the notion that communication would lead towards peace. And so the citizen diplomacy movement was, so I'd say, if you want to say, recognized by the government as track to diplomacy, but it wasn't initiated by it. It wasn't controlled by it. It was a kind of spontaneous activity by this sort of amorphous group of people for a variety of kind of related reasons. So I hope I'm making this a little clear. So, for instance, the beginning of space bridges, which were communication using satellite telecommunications between the Soviet Union and the US, began as an outgrowth of a rock and roll concert, the US concert, that was scheduled for Labor Day in 1982. It was financed by Steve Wozniak of Apple, one of the Apple founders. And they were planning this conference. They said, wouldn't it be cool if we could connect with, the Soviet Union? And they said, how would we do that? And one of the people there, Rick Lukens, knew Hickman. And they knew that Hickman, who was by that time the director of this institute at Esalen, knew how to work with the Soviets, and in fact was about ready to go to the Soviet Union as part of his work with this association of space explorers that you mentioned. So they asked him to explore whether a video link could be set up, and he went off to Moscow. This was one of a number of things that he was doing, and he was traveling with Rusty Schweickart, who was one of the American astronauts who had been in space. Hickman and Schweickart were meeting with Soviet officials about the Space Association. And then they said, and also we're interested in setting up a video link. So they were referred by people in the space sector to Gos Teleradio, and and because of the prestige of Schweikert, Gos Teleradio took this request seriously, and they agreed to set this up. And Hickman and Schweikert went back to California. They told the US Festival, look, this is going to happen. They've agreed. Um, and then other people who were sort of around Esalen, Kim Spencer and Evelyn Messenger in particular, who were producers of these kinds of video link programs, were sort of notified to be on call, to be ready. They were going to do this. And then nothing happened. They didn't hear anything from the Soviets. And Hickman was preparing to go off on a family vacation, and he stopped at a payphone and called the embassy, the U.S. embassy, and they said, "Oh, we've been looking for you. The Soviets want to do this, and you're supposed to be on a plane tomorrow." So he dropped the family vacation, went on the plane to Moscow, and they set up this video link. And on the Soviet side, they had about 300 kids with beach balls uh, and Hawaiian shirts, and but also rock musicians and folk dancers. They had a whole program all set up. And so they made the connection to the US Festival with Evelyn and Kim's assistants. And in the middle of the rock festival, which was produced by the famous rock and roll producer Bill Graham, there was a big screen, and all of a sudden appeared these Russian kids bouncing beach balls and from Moscow. And Graham, whose family were Hungarian, uh, looked at this for about 15 minutes and said, "This is Soviet propaganda. I'm not having it," and pulled the plug. And so the people in California called Moscow and told Hickman, and Hickman didn't tell the Russians because he didn't want to spoil it. But it led to a second space bridge that was later, but really wasn't under Esalen's control at all. It had became a life of its own. So the second one was at the second US Festival, and then a whole series of them took off of these space bridges that later involved Peter Jennings on ABC Nightline to millions of Americans with members of the U.S. Congress and this U.S. and the Russian Supreme Soviet. So, and this was very well publicized in the U.S. and even more so in the Soviet Union. It was the first kind of direct conversation between Americans and Russians, even though there were curated audiences to a certain extent on each side. It was a huge step forward, and for many people, credited with building a kind of anti-war sense, like we don't want to bomb these people. We can't imagine bombing these people. So this was sort of again part of this citizen diplomacy movement. Now, as far as the exchanges and bringing Yeltsin, Esalen initiated a whole series of exchanges, and many of the Russian reformers um, somehow got involved. I mean, the this whole movement was sort of under the patronage of Velikhov, who was the head of the Academy of Sciences on the Russian side. And so it gave cover for people to travel, and uh, and the Russians loved going to California, and they were able to go to California and sit in hot tubs with young people and to discuss the things, and so this led to these series of exchanges, and including the one you referenced with Yeltsin, which, by the way, it was a kind of a spontaneous thing. They were then, as Hickman described it to me, they were driving somewhere else to go to a meeting, and Yeltsin saw the grocery store and said, "Stop, pull over." And he went in and went up and down the aisles looking at all the produce and the meat and everything that was available there. And and there are pictures of him doing this. And then he came back out and he said to Hickman, "You tricked me. You set this up deliberately. This is a Potemkin village." And Hickman finally convinced him, no, this was an ordinary American grocery store, at which Yeltsin's response was, "They lied to us. They lied to us." Uh, and it is, many people say it contributed greatly to his decision then to leave the Communist Party.
Then, when you mentioned those space bridges when people could see each other from Moscow and California, I like to ask who had access to that.
It was a broadcast on television, and so they were broadcast on television. They were broadcast on television in the Soviet Union as well. And so there was one of them that was a famous one that was actually from Boston to Leningrad, and it was supposed to be about women's issues. And the women in the audience in Boston asked the question of the Soviet women, saying here that there's the advertising and TV is highly sexualized. There's all kinds of sex on TV, and it made this woman uncomfortable. But she was asking, okay, what's it like in the Soviet Union? And this is when the woman made the famous statement, "There is no sex in the Soviet Union." And the whole audience burst out laughing on both sides. This woman was humiliated. She really meant to say, "There's no sex on TV, there's no sexualization of things." But what she said was, "There's no sex." And it became sort of the thing that everyone remembers, and particularly in the Soviet Union, from that event. But when Peter Jennings did these space bridges, they were on national TV. It was on ABC TV, and which is one of the three main broadcast channels in the U.S., and it was on main broadcast channels in the Soviet Union. So it wasn't secret or restricted. I think that some of them, the earlier ones, were on public broadcast system, but I would have to double check that. Um, all of them are available online. There's an archive of them, of these space bridges that Kim Spencer created. But they were pretty broadly broadcast. And then there were others that were done by sort of individual institutions. I think San Diego Sister City did one. with someone in the Soviet Union about World War II during that period. There was a whole series that was done out of Tufts University with counterparts in the Soviet Union. It became a kind of a pretty available technology and pretty wide audiences participated.
There is a project called SovAm or SovAm. Teleport was a massive deal during the late Cold War and early post-Soviet eras because American and Russian scientists basically connected the two superpowers via the internet. And in the early 90s, SovAm became the first provider of the SWIFT system for the emerging Russian banking system. And we know that the first domain was SovAm.com in Soviet Union or Russia. And that was quite interesting. And I would like to ask you, what were the drivers behind that activity, and how is it possible that such a sensitive area as a banking system, Americans and Russians, they found a way to work together?
Yeah. Also, an interesting story and connected to citizen diplomacy movement is, if you're interested in detail, there's an interview I have with Joel Schatz, who's on in the archive, but also I recount some of this in my book. Joel Schatz was a peace activist. His wife had a project called Peace Trek, uh, and yeah, which was a coloring book and posters and like a course about how to move from confrontation to peace. And someone suggested to him that he should get the Soviets involved in this. So he wrote to the cultural attaché in the UN and asked if he could get an invitation to visit the Soviet Union. And he got the invitation with the idea of promoting this peace program. He hired as his interpreter a woman named Anya Kucharev, who worked at the Esalen Institute. And he hired her as his translator because he didn't trust the in-tourist translators that he was going to be given when he traveled there. And Anya went with him and connected him with Joseph Golden, who was this other contact that I mentioned previously for the Esalen Institute. And Golden was very well connected because of his connection to the Russian Academy of Sciences. So Joel took with him a Tandy computer. In the old days, Radio Shack, it was a Tandy 80 or Tandy 50. There was a model anyway. Radio Shack sold these early computer consoles. He took that with him, and uh, and through Golden, he met people in the space sector, and then he was introduced to the Academy of Sciences, and he was asked. And by the way, he's not a technology guy. He's not an IT guy. He was asked, well, what did he want to do? And he said, well, he wanted to figure out how to connect the Soviet Union and the US, and he'd like to set up email. So Velikov was interested in this and was interested in learning more about computer technology and the technology that was developing in the US. Generally, Velikov, according to these accounts, and let me preface and go back a second. One of the things that Hickman told me is we only know what the Americans thought because we have access to that. We don't know what the Soviets were thinking. We don't know for sure what their motives were. So we're only guessing to a certain extent. But the guesses that we have are that Velikov was looking for a way out of the stagnation of the late Soviet period. And that was part of the reason for his interest in human potential. He was also interested in technology. And so they had very limited ways to gather that kind of knowledge. So when an American falls in their lap, they took that opportunity to make those connections. So they said, um, so let's do it. And so Joel went back to California and worked with people around. It wasn't just the Esalen circles, it was the citizen diplomacy circles and technology circles to figure out how to make this connection. And they started with very primitive, sort of almost like fax type connections, but then they developed the first internet connection. And they did it, and I think it's worth looking for the details in his account. That's not what's, I don't think you want that level of detail here, but the Department of Defense tried to stop him. They read about this connection in the New York Times. They called him in and said, "You can't do this." He engaged a bunch of lawyers with him, uh, who who said, "Well, there's nothing in the law to prevent us from doing it." And they ultimately backed down the Department of Defense. Joel, through some other contexts, reached out to George Soros to fund this effort. And Soros uh, put in $500,000 in order to allow Joel to pursue this connection at a time when they didn't have the technology. He didn't even have a business plan. He didn't have a company. And he set up the San Francisco Moscow teleport as a way of getting started. They had no status on the Russian side because there was no law on joint ventures at that time. So it wasn't a joint venture, but he was collaborating with these computer institute in connected with the Academy of Sciences, and it was called an experiment, and so therefore they got away with it. And uh, he was he and Velikov were very clear that there was no way there was going to grow any of these economic connections without having communications. And at that time, there were 33 long distance lines out of the Soviet Union total for the entire country. So the communications were horrible, and it was very difficult to even conceive of a real economic relations. So this is the direction they wanted to go in. And some of their first clients, once they established the email, was the CIA and the KGB. Both became clients in order to use this new means of communication.
That's the best clients, we have to say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely,
I'd
absolutely.
like to link this what you said to the next topic, which is SP Dialog, and that was a historic business venture created in 1987. And there is a long story about it, but basically it was born directly out of Gorbachev's perestroika reform in the Soviet Union, which allowed capitalist entities and capital to participate in business in the Soviet Union, in Russia basically. And in this case, the USSR Academy of Sciences in Moscow, State University, the private company KAMAZ, which produced cars and vehicles for industrial complex, they all participated in some way. And then additionally, they licensed the distribution of the software. So Microsoft, Lotus, Ashton Tate companies, they were helping just not only to distribute the software, but also to translate it to Russian so people can use it in Soviet Union. And all this to provide the technology, the software, the translation is leading to the question about the gap between the Soviet Union and the United States at the time. So How was it when someone wanted to buy a Western tech in the Soviet Union?
So let me go back to how did this venture get started, because in some ways it also goes back to the story about citizen diplomacy. In this case, a guy named Joseph Ritchie, who was a Chicago futures exchange businessman who made a fortune, uh, was he had 13 kids. He wanted a world in which his kids wouldn't be blown up in a thermonuclear war, and uh, decided that the economic ties between the two countries would help keep that from happening. And so, as Gorbachev sort of made it possible to consider business, Ritchie went to the Soviet Union, and he, uh, as you talked about, developed a consortium on the Soviet side that was Moscow State University, KAMAZ, and some other entities, uh, and they became the second joint venture once the joint venture law was passed. The very first joint venture, first one registered, was for a pizza delivery truck, which is another weird story, but Astro, I think was the name of it. Um, and so in those days, computers couldn't be exported to the Soviet Union because of these technology restrictions in the US. So software could, but the hardware couldn't. So it was so there was some general notion about what they were going to do together with this joint venture, but Ritchie didn't really know, and they didn't really know. And Ritchie hired a guy named Peter Derby, whose interview is also in my archive, who was a descendant of Russian emigres and who was a Russian speaking American, uh, and who had been in the Soviet Union when Billy Joel visited the Soviet Union. So he was on Billy Joel's team for that concert. So he was someone who was he was a known person to who could navigate the differences between the two cultures. So Peter was hired to go to Moscow and develop a business plan. And he went there and then brought his brother over, and the two of them created a business plan for this Dialog joint venture, which on the Soviet side was big. It was huge, and it had different regional component parts because of different organizations that were involved with it. And so some of these component parts became involved with computer licensing and sales of computer software, like you described. Others became involved with construction, all kinds of different business areas because they had this early connection with this joint venture. And Dialog uh, began to accumulate funds because they were very profitable. Had hard currency earnings, uh, but they couldn't get at them because these earnings were the Soviet banking system wasn't equipped to handle money transfers from from the two different systems. And so that led to the creation of Dialog Bank, the first private bank, which was, again, Peter Derby set up as an outgrowth of this Dialog joint venture. And it was really then later, Peter set up the investment bank, Troika Dialog. So all of these were sort of outgrowth of this early activity of the joint venture. So as I was saying, these early joint ventures under Gorbachev were a transition time. And so this dialogue was a transition from the Soviet market to what later became the Russian market economy. And the people like Peter Derby and his counterpart, Pyotr Zrelov, on the who was a deputy manager at Kamaz and who was the point person for Dialog, were really the path breakers in establishing the new market economy. So when Dialog became so profitable, um, it and they needed to figure out how to access money. This had never been a problem in the Soviet system. Um, they they had no legal basis to set up a bank, and Zrelov came to Peter Derby's wedding and said, "Listen, I know you were, this was in New York, and he says, I know you don't, you're finished in Russia, but please help me solve this problem, and how can we do this?" And under the law, and the law on cooperatives had just passed in the Soviet Union, and said, "Well, we have these cooperative banks in the United States, so let's see if we can set up a bank as a cooperative and fit into the Soviet legislation," which is what they did. And he wrote the registration for this, and then and moved and back to Moscow with his wife, and they stayed there until I think 1998, but and bridged the gap between this two periods. Um, but then later he set up Troika Dialog as an investment bank, which was quite different than the Dialog, the commercial bank. And once they had solved this problem and set up a functioning private commercial bank, they were flooded with requests from Western companies who wanted their services. And they opened branches in the Radisson Hotel, where the foreign community was headquartered at that time, and really became again the facilitator for the early entry of multinationals into Russia in the late perestroika and then early period.
During my preparation for this interview, I got interesting information that between 1990 and 1994, there were around 215 projects between the Soviet Union and Americans, and it was founded by billions of dollars. But when I went to details, I found Project Harmony, which operated at the school and community level. And when I was digging, I found that there was a police exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, especially between Massachusetts and Petrozavodsk in Karelia in Soviet Union, which is the city north of St. Petersburg. I would like to ask you, how is it possible that American police officers went to the Soviet Union and what they were doing there? How can we imagine such a program?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it goes back to citizen diplomacy. The person I interviewed was Charles Hosford, Again, that's in the archive, and he's described in the book as well. And so he and two of their friends were concerned about world peace, and this was in the 80s, around or mid 80s, and they had no idea what to do about it. And they tried to come up with ideas for how there could be exchanges between people. And one of the founders was a teacher in a high school, and so they came up with the idea of student exchanges, choral exchanges. So that's why they came up with the name Project Harmony. And because it refers to these school exchanges for choral groups. And they got in touch with Soviet officials in the UN, and the guy they contacted put them in contact with the Sputnik Youth Travel Organization of the Soviet Union, and he did it because he wanted to have his son come from the Soviet Union to the US. So the condition of the deal was, well, they would organize a group to go to the Soviet Union. And in return, they would host groups of Soviet kids, including his kid, to come to Vermont. This is where they were started. And this started a whole series of exchange programs. This organization became known for its exchange programs. And they're being in Vermont, they were, the state of Vermont established a sister state relationship with the Soviet province of Karelia, which is up on the border with Finland, north of Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And at the same time, Bernie Sanders was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and Bernie was also interested in promoting exchanges. So they had a lot of local support for these kinds of programs. So as an organization that became known for exchanges, they were contacted by a group of policemen from these small cities in the center of Massachusetts, from Leominster and Medford. They were small cities in central Massachusetts, and they said, can you set up an exchange for us to go? We want to go." And so Project Harmony had been doing children's exchanges with the Palace in Petrozavodsk, which is the capital of the province of Karelia. And the husband of the director of the Children's Palace was the head of police department in Petrozavodsk. And so since they already had these existing relationships, they set up an exchange to go to Petrozavodsk. And the police put together a delegation of about 30 people, including 4 or 5 small towns and the Massachusetts State Police. And they got CBS News, one of the main US news channels, interested in this, and they embedded a reporter in to travel with this delegation. And they took with them all kinds of gifts like armored vests, batons. They even took a drug sniffing dog that as a present, German Shepherd, and they went off to Petrozavodsk and did this exchange, and with the understanding there would be, and it was then became known because it was a news broadcaster, there was an exchange in return for these police from Petrozavodsk to come to the US. And so the Project Harmony wanted to take them not only to Vermont, but to Washington, D.C., so they could see more of the country. And the FBI became aware that there were Russian police coming to Washington, D.C., and they invited them to the FBI Academy. And it, they showed them all around the FBI Academy. I mean, it was quite an event. And of course, the FBI at that point was trying to learn about like the Russian mafia. And, they were asking these guys, these were police officers, but these were provincial police officers from Petrozavodsk. They had no idea about any Russian mafia. So it was a complete mismatch of expectations. But in any event, the State Department became interested in this program, and because they had exchange programs for policemen in different countries, and there became they developed a whole police exchange program with Russia. This was then after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And they set up domestic violence task force programs. They brought the Project Harmony developed a partnership with Michigan State University and the University of South Carolina and their criminal justice departments. They brought students from those universities to the Soviet Union in all different cities all around the Soviet Union to run seminars on criminal justice and particularly domestic violence, and focused on domestic violence prevention. They also introduced computers into these police departments. It was an unbelievable interchange between people that you can't imagine were, talking to each other, but it was a very wide scale program, which sort of ultimately kind of floundered when they encountered more resistance to this domestic violence promotion on the Russian side, but it was a very wide scale program, and an example of the degree to which American ways of doing things penetrated into the Russian provinces. It was not just American activity in Moscow and St. Petersburg. These were Volgograd, this was Petrozavodsk. These were, right in the heartland of Russia.
I think it was also fascinating for people from Petrozavodsk or smaller cities, because we know that Moscow or St. Petersburg operated in the way that, for instance, if the book was published in Washington on Monday, Wednesday it was in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because this was how the system worked. But Petrozavodsk, nobody heard about it. So I think it was also very interesting and fascinating how those programs were targeting those smaller cities, and also for the people to give opportunity to travel to the United States from Petrozavodsk. That was something unbelievable in that time. So I think this is very important factor to highlight, that it was not only Moscow, St. Petersburg, but also smaller cities.
Yeah, and if you look at it, there were other programs of bringing Russians to the U.S., like Business for Russia, for instance, or there was a program where they went around to all throughout Siberia and smaller cities in central Russia and brought people to the U.S. who stayed in people's homes in Burlington, Vermont, and Cincinnati and Cleveland and all over, in which there was actual exchange and interest between on both sides. So,
how did the American business sector perceive and understand Russian privatization in the 1990s? And what did this transition signify for the US business community in terms of profit and strategic opportunity?
Well, an interesting and important question, because I think privatization in Russia is complex and not always understood well by looking at strictly from a Western business perspective. The real goal of privatization and the agency behind it was Russian, and it was the desire of the Russian reformers around Yeltsin to prevent a restoration of the of socialism, to put roadblocks in the continuation of the state planning, to change the economic system fundamentally in such a way is that it could not be changed back very easily. So just keeping in mind that in Soviet times, there was no private property. There were individual rights, but no to apartments, but there was no private property. So this is a fundamental change to institute private property through privatization. And the reformers, including Chubais and Gaidar and all the whole set of people around them, understood that this would be a dramatic change. There would be a reaction at some point, and that they had a very short time to implement privatization. They even referred to themselves as kamikaze pilots, linking back to Japanese suicide bombers who attacked U.S. ships in World War II that were called kamikazes. Um, so they knew what they wanted to do, which was to transform state property into private property as the basis for a new economic system. And they then needed new market-based institutions based on that privatization. They knew what they wanted to do, but they didn't know how to do it. And here we come to the expertise of foreigners uh, who brought means of privatization to Russia. And in particular, the Harvard Institute of International Development and the individual Jeffrey Sachs are associated with this privatization. It was but it was really a model that was brought by Sachs and HRAD from privatizations that had already taken place in Poland and the Czech Republic. And it was based on the idea that each citizen, each Soviet or Russian, at this point, Russian citizen, would receive a coupon, a voucher. And this had a face value of 10,000 Russian rubles. And these vouchers would then give people the right to change them or purchase shares in newly privatized businesses. And so this voucher privatization led to creation of stocks in the newly privatized businesses. So using this method, they changed about 50% of the Russian economy from state ownership to private ownership between 1992 and 1994. Now, Harvard had the skills to give them the schemes for this, but they didn't have the practical knowledge of how to do it. And so Chubais's Committee on Privatization had a tender to get Western financial institutions to advise them on how to implement voucher privatization. So there was a competition, and in this point, the critical person was Boris Jordan, who joined Credit Suisse just before this period and convinced Credit Suisse to bid on this program by offering to do it for nothing. And the whole reason for that was that by implementing privatization, Credit Suisse got a jump on every other uh, Western financial institution in terms of knowledge of what was going on in the economy, what companies were in good shape, what companies were not in good shape. But in any event, Jordan worked under Chubais and Chubais's direction and put together the voucher privatization. The the Russian people did not understand much about this. They didn't understand what shares were. They were facing an economic depression because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so there began this market of sales of these shares. And so on the one hand, you had Western financial institutions um, or joint ventures like United Financial Group or not or Dialog, Troika Dialog, were buying these coupons from people because the people didn't know what they were and they needed money, and so there were literally stands set up on the street, and Troika. In one of the interviews, a person described to me they would go in the morning and get cash. They would go sit with bags of cash in behind a card table and purchase vouchers from people for cash on the street. They would then come home at night and record all those vouchers in the central registry to amass numbers of them so they could bid on companies that they wanted to control. And so Westerners understood stocks as a means of control of ownership. Russians, on the other hand, didn't understand that. And there was a simultaneous kind of process going on of what was called spontaneous privatization, because um, in the late perestroika period, the Gorbachev passed legislation that gave more freedom to factory directors to control their own enterprise. So they became sort of small, kind of local powers over large enterprises scattered around through the country. So as the Soviet Union deteriorated, those factory directors, often referred to as red directors, sort of took control of effective control of their enterprise and all the connected things around it and the cash flow that came from it. Um, Even those enterprises that uh, were privatized and there were new shareholders, the red directors considered them theirs, and they amassed shares from workers in the enterprise to battle against these outsiders and trying to take control of their enterprises. In this initial phase, this voucher privatization, many of the most important enterprises strategic are considered strategic for the economy in oil and gas and natural resources, telecommunications, defense industries were not privatized. They were held back and owned by the state. In some cases, they were converted into enterprises in a legal form, but all the shares were held by the state. So there was in this first period the development of shares uh, out of the coupons. And then after the shares were in circulation, there had to be new institutions to buy and sell shares. And Russians had, again, no skills in doing this. Some Russian entrepreneurs started to trade in shares, but mostly this kind of market was defined by foreigners, many Americans, who set up investment banks in Russia, and they acted almost as intermediaries for foreigners who wanted to get access to the Russian market. So if you were interested in some cement plant in that had been privatized and there were shares available, you would contact, say, Troika Dialog or UFG to find out if those shares were available. So all of the trading mechanisms then were developed, and institutions were developed by foreigners for trading in shares. And that included things like share registries, and then ultimately the stock exchange itself, which was set up by USAID funded program that sort of took some antiquated NASDAQ software, adapted it, and set up the first RTS, the Russian trading system, which was the first automated sale vehicle for exchange of shares. So when foreigners looked at the Russian market and wanted to take part in it, it was through shares. Meanwhile, Russians were more interested in physical assets and the physical control of assets. And this led to some of the later conflicts between shareholders and directors that characterized the period, sometimes violent confrontations. It certainly is a background to the well-known conflict that Bill Browder had later, but so this was set in motion in this period, 92 to 94, and then with foreign assistance developed into a system. And the Russian government also again lacked any financial expertise. So they in finance, and there was poor collection of taxes, there were deficits that needed to be funded. So the Russian government worked with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to set up bond programs, short and long-term bond programs that also became, with very high interest rates, it became very profitable for foreign investors. But they became almost like a pyramid scheme because that high interest was paid and then had to be refinanced in new bonds in the next period. So as we get towards 1996 and the presidential election, Boris Yeltsin was badly trailing in the polls to Zhuganov, the Communist Party candidate, and it looked like Zhuganov was going to win. And there then Chubais rallied the Russian business community to get behind Yeltsin's campaign and finance a more professional operation. At the same time, the Russian government was facing deficits and looked to be failing in the eyes of the electorate. So it again needed money. So the Russian government approached Boris Jordan and to figure out a scheme for loans beyond the government bonds that were already in existence. And Jordan and Stephen Jennings, his partner, came up with a plan for the Russian government to receive loans with the security of shares in these critical industries that had not yet been privatized, the major large-scale industries. So the idea was, Jordan's idea was that the loans would be made to the government. Most likely the government would default. So the loans would end up in the hands of entrepreneurs and bankers who would reform those industries and then sell them to operators. So it was a further modernization vehicle for the economy. When they submitted this plan, the reformers and those who were boosting Yeltsin's campaign changed it. And what they did was their banks associated with the budding oligarchs made the loans, got the shares, and then held them. And they became full-fledged oligarchs because they now got control over many of the major economic drivers of the Russian economy. And this is how they created this whole class of oligarchs who, at that point, then owned major industries, major media outlets, and major banks. This process was a Russian process. Separate from this, multinationals were entering the Russian market, uh, but mostly through greenfields, through developing their own businesses in an environment that now allowed private business. But there was not a great deal of participation in privatization by the international business. There were international investors, which is different in terms of how the process developed.
I would like to ask one question, and that's about the West at the time. Like, were American companies going like Americans for Americans, or did you experience any sort of like alliance, like British American, American German, French American, going together to Russia as a market?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's a mistake to just focus only on Americans. And I partly did that in the book because of limits. There was so much going on. But yes, the first joint venture that I participated in was with Deutsche Bundespost Telekom, Germans. And lots of Europeans were involved in Russia at this period. There was a European Russia Chamber of Commerce. There was a lot of activity by international organizations like the OECD. Um, uh, um, the Europe and the EU had its own aid and advisement programs that paralleled those that were financed by USAID. There was a program called TASIS that was very important. So, and there were certain sectors of the economy which were very much connected with the Europeans. So it was a mixture of people that all entrepreneurs from all over, including South Korea and Japan, and Indians as well, who were active in this period. It was a whole melange of people.
And just one more question then about the post-Soviet space, because Moscow, Russia, that was a target for American and Western companies because there is gas, there is oil and everything, all those metallurgical companies. But what about countries that emerge, like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Baltic countries? Were American business people also interested in that space, or they were focusing much on Moscow and Russia?
Um, so the term businessman is a broad term. So there's entrepreneurs, there's small businesses, there's trading companies, there's investors, there's multinationals. So all had different levels of involvement. Um, I would say, for Kazakhstan in the beginning, it was mostly about natural resources and getting access to oil and gas. Uzbekistan had very little Western influence because the President Karimov was not a reformer, and the currency was not convertible, and there was no prospect for it to become convertible. The Caucasus, there was interest, but I would say more by smaller entrepreneurs and individuals and smaller companies. Baltics it became a part of Europe very quickly, and so there was a lot of interest there. And even so even within Russia, there was a wide variation of activity from across the country. So, Moscow was this is a capital, huge amounts of activity there, much is somewhat less in St. Petersburg. And the more you got into the provinces, the fewer foreigners you would see active there. But there always were some, and in some ways surprising how many. Um, or where you would see a foreign business or individual pop up. So,
I want to ask you about the sort of entertainment industry, which was also involved with American companies. We know the Cosmopolitan magazine, there is McDonald's and famous pictures from Moscow, how people were waiting to try the American food, but also the Radio Maximum and Starlight Diner or Dinner. So I like to pick one of from all those three because we don't have time to speak about all of them. But which one do you think has sort of the biggest impact if we speak about American companies in Russia regarding to these three?
oh, this is a subject that's really hard for me to choose. And because these are also important stories, I want to just say briefly about Radio Maximum and then Cosmopolitan. I think so, if you'll allow me. So Peter Gerwe, who started Radio Maximum, was part of the original US Festival. He was introduced to Russia through the US Festival and then Hickman, and he recognized that there was an opportunity in the Soviet Union. There was no FM radio. The state radio were on different frequencies. He came in and got the rights to FM radio. He started Radio Maximum on December 25th, 1991. Yeah, on Christmas. And he Gorbachev resigned, said he was resigning, and this producer came in and said, "We've got to break in. We've got to do a news update." And Peter said, "No way. We are not a political channel, never will be. We're purely entertainment." And he played Beatles songs. And he began purely as an entertainment venture. And later he developed CTC TV, also purely entertainment. He made his business there by staying out of politics, but it it sort of brought the music and culture to broad audiences in Russia and in post-Soviet Russia. Cosmopolitan was an outgrowth of Moscow News. So Dirk Sauer and his wife uh, founded Moscow News, and it was mainly is a first English and the dominant English language paper in Russia, and it uh, made its money through ads, but it was barely getting by. And his wife had the idea that they should get the rights to have a Russian version of Cosmopolitan. And apparently, there had been a previous attempt, and Hearst, who owned Cosmopolitan, had a bad experience with a previous partner. But Dirk and his wife hounded them, followed them around the world, convinced them finally to give them the rights to publish um, a version of Cosmopolitan in Russian. And they began publishing it. It became the Bible of young women in post-Soviet Russia. It was the articles were some of them were taken from the regular English language Cosmopolitan, and some of them were written in Russia, and it was a huge advertising vehicle. So some of the issues of Cosmopolitan were up to 900 pages because they had so many ads in amongst the stories. And the in what Dirk said was that it was so influential that groups of young women would sort of pool their money to buy one copy and then pass it around. And it was like throughout the whole country, but it introduced sort of ideas about women that quite different than what was popular at the time. I mean, at the time Cosmopolitan was published, he said the only women's magazines in the country were uh, Farm Woman and Factory Woman, and they were just Soviet era like images of what a woman was. And he received um, letters from people who said, by reading your magazine, I realized I didn't need to take this abuse from my husband, and I kicked him out. And lots of sort of lifestyle changes that came about as a result of that magazine, and which he considered his really most influential in sort of the life and sensibilities of women in Russia.
Then many people will ask, how does he know? From where does he know? So, as a scholars, can you say within, let's say, 2, 3 minutes, what's the source of your information, but also what is the limitation of your research? Because we, as a scholars, are critical to ourselves.
My information begins with the fact that I was there and experienced some of the same things that the other Americans and other foreigners did. So I have some sense of perspective. Um, I and because of that, I had a network of people to tap to do interviews. But I also am aware that it's limited because I interviewed and spoke with people for whom Russia was a positive experience, at least for a part of their time. Not many of them ended badly, but they look back as it being some of the most exciting and interesting period of their life. I used to say that you could almost tell from a foreigner when they left the plane, they either divided into the group that hated Russia or the Soviet Union immediately or that loved it. And there was this love-hate thing. There was a whole number of people who rotated through the country as part of a rotation or because they got hazard pay or, exotica or who never learned the language and, tried to eat pizza the entire time they were there. Those people I didn't speak to because they didn't have much insight into the country. So yes, there's a limit. There's the success bias of the people I interviewed, and we have to accept that. But on the other hand, they had the most insight into the life of the country. Most of them tried to integrate themselves into the life of the country. And that's what made them successful. And it also is what they learned the most. And so I'm trying to capture that through the kinds of interviews that I do. At the same time, and I want to repeat what I said earlier, is as far as what the Russians or the Soviets or Russians were thinking about their reasons for these things, we can only guess. So we don't really know. So a lot of there's speculation about things, and we didn't talk about the rise of Putin as a reaction to some of this American influence, but I think some of that is also guesswork, uh, as to what it is that's going on in the motivations, which are often complex, not simple. Um, and without some cultural sensitivity, it's really hard to understand what it was that formed their motivation. But what I saw often in my experience in Russia is foreigners and Russians talking about something, you even using the same words and meaning completely different things because they had a different cultural context that they were viewing the whatever it was under discussion. So yeah, I'm aware of all that, but mostly what we have is a record of uh, declared intentions for people at the top level leadership. But history is often made along with that by the activities of people on the ground. And that is also what I'm trying to capture with the work that I've done.
Then many thanks for sharing your insights, your stories, and your honesty with the sources of knowledge, which in these times, one of the best characteristics we can wish for scholars and researchers. I value this, and I recommend people to watch either the book talks on YouTube that you conducted, and also to have a look at the book interviews. Also, you run the website with the archive, and I will put everything into the YouTube description because it's such a complex topic with so many subtopics that we can speak about for hours, perhaps days.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we try to keep it within 60, 70 minutes. And I'm very thankful for your time, for your attitude to join the IO Thinker. And also, I want to wish you good luck for your research, energy to your work. And again, many thanks for being.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure and good luck. Thank you.